Hugo was right when he said there's nothing more powerful than an idea whose time has come. Yes, the idea of freedom, liberty, and justice for all. Yes, that was the idea, but I declare that now is the time. And if America is going to have a chance at living out the true meaning of its creed, that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, then we cannot afford for this nation or its leaders to have selective amnesia.
Welcome to the Policy Lowdown, a podcast from the Maryland Center on Economic Policy, offering straight talk on the policies that matter most to Maryland communities. I'm your host, Kevin Slayton. In our latest episode, I invited the MedSep policy team to share the issues that they're going to be following in this year's legislative session. And today, for part 2 of our legislative session preview, I'm extremely excited and honored to be joined by someone who will have a very busy schedule for the next few months, Maryland Senate President Bill Ferguson. Senator Ferguson, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Our listeners might be more familiar with your name than some of our other guests, but I'd love it if you could share a bit more about your background on how you came to this work.
Sure. Well, certainly I'd say, most importantly, it was very much unexpected. This was not necessarily the path that I ever expected to be on, and didn't ever really see myself in elected office in the first place. I grew up in Maryland, outside of D.C., and my mom worked for a amalgamated transit union for the vast majority of her life, retired from amalgamated transit union. My dad was a commercial real estate developer, and I was an only child, and so I had both ends of the political spectrum covered. And growing up, I was very much my father's son, and so went to school thinking that I was going to go into business and was going to do something around banking or investment, and then ran in college, was at a professional development session that I walked into the wrong room and landed in a Teach for America info session. And so because of that experience and the kind of concept of the achievement gap that kind of flew in the face of what I understood capitalism to be, and this idea that a zip code could be the single biggest determinant of somebody's life outcome, not how hard they worked or what information they had. And it really motivated me to try and learn more and try and question why I was doing what I was doing. So lo and behold, I'll fast forward, I ended up teaching in West Baltimore and taught 9th, 10th, and 11th graders U.S. history and U.S. government. That changed my life dramatically and made me question everything I believed, and really saw the depth of inequity that existed between the experience I had growing up and what my students were facing every single day in West Baltimore. And so that really motivated me to get more involved. And I stayed in the school system until 2010. I went to law school at night, so I worked for Dr. Alonzo when he was here, and then ran in 2010 to try and improve public education outcomes here in the city, and realized that if you really want to do that at scale, you've got to change the law. And so that's what got me into politics.
Outstanding. 14 years, 2024, that's a long time. And hearing your story about working with young people, it explains for me, I've often sort of watched your defense of children in some interesting situations in Baltimore City that seem different, but I totally get it now.
Well, it's just kids are kids,
yeah.
And at the end of the day, look, there's a lot, in the city, we have a lot of young people who are facing some real severe, barriers to success that, in other places and spaces, if they had been born elsewhere or under different circumstances, overcoming those challenges would never be something that they face. I often said that, the kids, the 14, 15, and 16-year-olds that I taught every day, very often had a greater challenge getting to and from school every day than anything I had to face my entire life to that point as their teacher. And so it just put a real perspective on the scope of challenges, but it's kids, they're kids. And they're impacted by their environment and their experiences. And it's the job of the public to help make those experiences and their lives a little bit easier so they can maximize their potential.
Understood. 14 years again. Fifth session. What are some of the highlights of your time here in Annapolis that you're most proud of?
Yeah, and fifth session as the presiding officer. So, that's the one that's, I didn't expect to be in this role either. But in 2019, my colleagues asked me to kind of take over the helm after following someone that had been here for 33 years. There's many, many things that I'm proud of. I mean, my tenure overall, I would say the 21st Century School Facilities Initiative in the city is probably one of my biggest. Now it's sort of seen as just an assumed thing, but when I was first elected, we were talking about Baltimore City school facilities. We still have a lot to do. Don't get me wrong. We're still not there. But, this idea that if you had said to me in 2010 that we would build 28 brand new school buildings in the city of Baltimore at that time, I think everybody would have said we're crazy. But it was kind of a joint collaborative effort. It has not been an easy path, but I think that when you look at what we've done over the last 10 years with school facilities, Baltimore City has built more new schools than any other public school district in the entire country. And we've done it on time, on budget, and it's a testament to what can be done. Now, we have to make sure that the quality of what's happening inside of the building is as good as the building itself, and that's what we're working on now with the blueprint, which is another thing that I'm proud of, but we have a long way to go to make sure that it meets its potential.
Looking ahead of this legislative session, which officially started yesterday, we're about 24 hours in, what do you see as some of the biggest challenges and opportunities facing this state right now, and how has that informed your legislative priorities for the session? Yeah,
I think the big thing is that this is a session where we are really normalizing. We've had 4 sessions now where in 2020, that's where we passed the blueprint initially, had to overcome a veto later, but that was the session of COVID. And then we had the session where it was full on COVID in 21. And then 22 was an election year with redistricting. And then 23 last year was a new administration. This is the first session we've had in a while where it's sort of getting back to normal. But that also means it's normalized revenues too. We don't have the federal dollars that we once had. And so it's going to force us to really prioritize what's most important for us to invest in moving forward. And it does mean we're going to have to make some cuts here and there to programs that maybe in the past we could sort of have floated, even if they didn't have great outcomes. Now we're going to have to be a little bit more tight about what investments we make to make sure that they're getting the biggest return. And so the budget's going to be the biggest issue, and then housing is going to be an enormous focus area. We know the single biggest driver of costs for families in Maryland is the cost of housing. And we just don't have enough supply, and we have to find a way to increase the amount of affordable housing and housing units overall to reduce prices. That will help all Marylanders, not just those who have those units, because housing drives up prices everywhere in the economy. And so that's going to be a big priority. And then we're also looking at how we can help young people really divert from some of the kind of delinquent and criminal behavior that we've seen when it comes to use of guns. We've got to figure out and focus on young people's access to guns and using it for harm. We've got to have better systems in place to divert their outcomes.
Well, you lead an awful lot of folks from different jurisdictions, different priorities. As you talk about your priorities, how have you, in the last few years, navigated how you send your signals to your leadership with what you want to move forward?
Yeah, it really depends. And I would say it's hard to say because the last few years have been so heavily influenced by COVID that it's funny, in 20 and 21 and 22 to a degree, COVID overtook everything. It just drove everything. How we were responding to it, what it did to our budget, what we were, whether kids were going to school or not, how are we recovering from the loss of learning that happened, the impact on businesses. And so COVID was really like it was the continuous story. Now we're in a different place. And so, I think we're trying to get back to basics, and we're rebuilding with the administration. I think the big difference too is having a Democratic administration with the more Miller administration has changed how we set priorities. I think we share this very, very similar values in many ways. And so, we're working collaboratively with the executive to help shape that agenda. And I think largely we're on the same path of, we've got to find a way to grow the economy in an inclusive way that expands opportunity for people. People have to feel safe. We have to invest in healthcare, and we've got to protect the environment. And so, there are big expectations for what's possible, which is good. We want to have big expectations, but it's like anything. At some point, there's an inexhaustible demand for limited resources, and so we've got to find a way to balance everything that we know is important, and do what we can with the resources we have.
Exactly. Public safety, education, always at the top of the constituents' priorities, but a lot of media coverage, particularly in the Baltimore area, has been around protection of children, interacting with police officers, et cetera. And with a new cadre of leadership that is particularly African-American male. Mm-hmm. The white guy in the room who comes and says, this is a priority to me, because I think, again, as you just spoke, you've had relationship with, I'm assuming, majority children of color in the school, and it's evident. Do you feel like the General Assembly got this one right when it comes to how prosecutors are interpreting the law? Or do you think it should be revisited?
Well, there's a couple things built into there. There's kind of two pieces of legislation that people point to. One is the reform bill, the juvenile reform bill that we did a year ago around kind of how within the system young people move through it and whether or not they get lost, they get stuck. I believe deeply in a lot of the reforms that we engaged in. And what we're seeing a year and a half later is that a lot of the changes in law that were put in place have not actually been implemented. There's a lot of misinformation about what had happened. And, I don't mean to point blame in any way. In fact, I'll take our own blame that we didn't do enough education around it. But this was a commission that was actually launched by the prior governor around juvenile reform and was a commission set out by the administration and was a bipartisan agreement to move this legislation forward. I think there's a lot of good pieces in it if it is implemented with fidelity. And I think it has not been thus far, and there's a lot of confusion about what this law did. So this year we have an obligation to really go back and try and clarify, maybe adjust around the edges. Nobody feels comfortable with where we are with young people with their access to guns and the number of kids that have either been shooters or have been shot. That should worry all of us. But it also should worry us that across the country, the number one leading cause of death for kids between the ages of 0 to 18 is firearms. That's insanity, right? And that is the thing, that is the reality that across the country we are dealing with. And so, this is a new phenomenon. It has never been this way that in a year, firearms are the number one leading cause of death for young people. We have to really think about that. If this were poison in water, we would say, we've got to get rid of that poison. When it's firearms, all of a sudden it's a different conversation. And so, I think that is the reality. And I wish there were a law we could pass that would all of a sudden change that. But I'm realistic that it takes lots of parties. It takes everyday execution of the law and really make sure that we have programs that meet kids' needs and families' needs to change behavior so that communities feel safe and bought in. And I think we can get there, but I do think that there are forces out here in 2024 for young people that are more challenging than any other generation has ever had to deal with. Social media, guns, post-COVID. This is a very unique time that I think is going to take a lot of effort from kind of an all-hands approach of dealing with forces that are brand new on young people.
Well, I certainly hope for the sake of my children and your children as well, that they're listening to you.
Yeah. I think we can get there. I mean, I really do. It's a challenging moment, but again, it's kids. Even the toughest kids. Many of them have faced trauma, and there's lots of the vast majority of kids will meet the expectations that are set for them if they have the right supports and structures to get there. And the challenge is too many of our young people don't have those structures and supports. And so we have to find better systems to help create those opportunities for young people.
Exactly. As you know, at the Maryland Center on Economic Policy, we talk about budgets all the time. That's what we do. Yeah. And the governor and the General Assembly are facing projected $761 million
roughly
this year, possibly growing. Don't ask me how I know that number. Probably Callie or Ben. Yeah. But you've worked through tough budget years as past because you've been on B&T yourself. So I'm interested to hear how are you thinking about this budget cycle and how to prepare for the coming years as the gap between the cost of providing services and how much revenue the state is expected to bring in continues to grow larger and larger.
Yep. Look, I think this is not abnormal for us. We are getting back to this more normal process where our budget is built on projected formulas. And so every year or many years we come in where it looks as though there is a deficit, and there are lots of tools and programs that the legislature is very used to of reallocation of special funds and things that balance the budget overall. We used to not be able to appropriate towards something. We could only cut. And so that's why you would see large deficits, because the legislature only had the ability to cut what was required to be funded in a future year. And so now that we've changed that constitutionally, it gives it a little bit more flexibility. And I think over time, you'll see those deficits close because we don't need to mandate every year huge amounts of money. We can cut and appropriate. And so, I'm less concerned about the deficit than many folks are. I'm confident we will balance this year and in the years ahead. I think the big challenge for us right now is about how to do that balance over time in a way that keeps Maryland competitive. And this is for at least this year in particular. I was just at the Senate President's Conference last week with another 27 other presiding officers of their Senate chambers. And the vast majority of them are talking about cutting taxes. And, that's not our reality. That's not a place that I think we want to be in any way. We provide more and better services than most other states. But we do have to recognize that we exist in a region and a country in which we are competing with other states to grow. And so I think it's really important for us to be mindful that, in these years of extraordinary budgets, our first year where it's a little bit tighter, that we really focus on prioritization and living within our means. And then as we determine what else we may need, we do that in a way that Marylanders feel confident that we have managed to what we have first, and then we look towards other options down the line.
Real quick, how are your colleagues finding this new relationship they have with the budget now that they can?
It's still new. It's still new. And this was intentional on our end, was to be slow and steady. We don't want to make huge shifts. We don't want to take the governor's budget, cut it in half, and shift it towards something that we think is better or different. It's on the margins, and I think really where it has changed the most is in the strength of the negotiation between the branches of government. It's less about actually utilizing the power and more about having the power to be utilized to make the conversation a little bit more balanced.
Gotcha.
And so I think we've worked really well with this administration. They're going to present their budget next year, and we've seen some early looks that there are going to be some hard cuts, and I think that's okay because I think there's been a measure of making sure that those who can least afford it aren't the ones that are on the chopping block. And I think that, we're going to navigate it this session. And I think that's an important exercise to go through.
Are there particular programs or areas of the budget that you think are particularly important to protect funding as you are weighing where exactly to cut?
Look, I think we know what helps to build an economy. We know that having a great education system is fundamental to building a strong economic base in the future. And so education has to be continuously our number one investment. And that's from early childhood, K-12, community college system, university system, and workforce. Because I think kind of lifelong learning and apprenticeships and on-the-job earn and learn opportunities are going to become ever more important. So I would say that's really a top priority. And then, of course, people have to be healthy. We are blessed to have great universities and healthcare systems. And so making sure that we're investing in accessible healthcare opportunities is crucial. We have to protect our environment. We have to invest in making sure that we address climate change to the degree we can. And people have to feel safe. So we have to invest in law enforcement and public safety and have a comprehensive approach to public safety. But those are the kind of core areas. If we get those right, the rest kind of starts to figure itself out.
Yeah. If you're just tuning in, we're speaking with Senate President Bill Ferguson. Just before we go, we're going to wrap up with a few. The other factor that affects the budget that's fully in the legislators' hands or control is the revenue. Mm-hmm. Do you expect the legislature to consider ways to bring in new revenue and avoid cuts, whether that is new fees to support the transportation trust fund or tax changes to bring more revenue into the general fund? What are you thinking?
Yeah, I think this General Assembly session, we have to really demonstrate that we are working together to live within the means of what we have. I think there are going to be specific areas where fees have not been touched for the last 8 years, and of course, costs have gone up in those last 8 years. So if you look at something like our trauma system in the state of Maryland, we are blessed to have one of the best trauma systems in the country, if not on the globe. And that is funded through a special fund that is funded through fees. Those fees have not been touched since probably 15 years. And so the cost for maintaining our trauma system, that's shock trauma downtown in Baltimore, but also the statewide trauma system, the medevacs, the helicopters, all the different pieces of it have outpaced the revenue that comes in through those fees. And so that's an area where it's very specific. It's tied to a specific revenue source. Costs have gone up. It's very obvious. It's not mismanagement. It's just simply costs have gone up. I think we're going to look where there are those opportunities where it's funded and very transparently. I think we could see some fee increases, but whole scale revenue, I don't see happening this year. We've got to manage to our budget first.
I think that literally is about all the time we have. I'm very, very appreciative, Senator, of your time, but we have to wrap it up there. Thank you again for taking time. Thank you to your staff for helping us to pull this together. I wish you all the best throughout this legislative session, and I hope you'll consider joining us again on our show. Once the session's over, we catch up. Maybe we can do it on the golf course. I'll
That'd
give
be
you
great.
a couple strokes ahead of me to maybe help you out. But again, thank you so much. To those listening, you can find podcast archives and resources from this episode at mdeconomy.org/policy-lowdown. And while you're there, you can sign up for our email list or support the Policy Lowdown by making a donation to the Maryland Center on Economic Policy. You can also find the Maryland Center on Economic Policy at MD Economy on Threads, Instagram, and Twitter, and MD Economy Policy on Facebook. Thank you for listening. See you next time.
Those that would stand up, call our nation back toward justice and righteousness are often bashed or labeled as socialist and unpatriotic. Many are labeled as instigators and